Welcome back to the fifth episode of our series on the philosophy of Antonio Gramsci. Today, we are diving into his ideas on language and culture. When we think of revolution, we often imagine street protests, political manifestos, or dramatic calls for change. But Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist philosopher, writing from a prison cell in the early 20th century, offered a quieter, more enduring vision of revolution. One thought through language, culture, and everyday life. Gramsci believed that true power wasn't just held in laws or armies. It was embedded in the stories we tell, the words we use, and the values we accept without question. For him, culture wasn't just art or literature. It was a battlefield of ideas, a space where hegemony is maintained, but also where it can be challenged. In this video, we will explore Gramsci's philosophy and his groundbreaking ideas on language, culture, and power. We'll unpack how he redefined Marxism, not by rejecting it, but by enriching it with a deeper understanding of how meaning itself can shape the world. Language and culture. Introduction. Gramsci, in his philosophy, introduces the term subaltern. These social groups create their own conception of the world. However, the concepts encapsulated in their thoughts are often embryonic, manifesting themselves, usually, in action rather than a coherent and articulate thought or language. The Gramscian concept of subaltern refers to a variety of non-dominant social groups, not only the working class, peasants, or slaves, but also women and religious and racial minorities. What makes these groups subaltern is their lack of coherent philosophy, which is a worldview that could be used to interpret the world. In other words, they lack their own language. Instead, they use what Gramsci calls a common sense, a fragmentary result of the sedimentation of ideas and beliefs that are disseminated by traditional intellectuals who are organically adjoined to their own class, that is, classes with different experiences and, most importantly, different positions within society. These beliefs are not only fragmentary, but they do not correspond to the experiences of subaltern groups. Quote, in acquiring one's conception of the world, one always belongs to a particular grouping, which is that of all the social elements which share the same mode of thinking and acting. We are all conformists, of some conformism or other, always men in the mass, or collective man. The question is this: of what historical type is the conformism, the mass humanity, in which one belongs? When one's conception of the world is not critical and coherent, but disjointed and episodic, one belongs simultaneously to a multiplicity of mass human groups. The personality is strangely composite. It contains Stone Age elements and principles of a more advanced science, prejudices from all past phases of history at the local level, and institutions of a future philosophy which will be that of a human race united the world over. To criticize one's own conception of the world means, therefore, to make it a coherent unity and to raise it to the level reached by the most advanced thought in the world. It therefore also means criticism of all previous philosophy, insofar as this has left stratified deposits in popular philosophy. The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. The first thing to do is to make such an inventory. End of quote. In other words, Gramsci provides a complex analysis of the ideology and consciousness of subaltern classes. These classes are not only physically dominated by the ruling classes, lacking any power or access to material resources, but they are also unable to develop a coherent worldview of their own that would fully correspond to their experience in life and adhere to their own class. This notion is not only an integral factor that allows the domination of the hegemony class over the subaltern, but it also prevents the subaltern classes from effectively resisting the domination and exercising counter-hegemony. Following Marx's discussion of alienation, Gramsci focuses on the gap between thought and actions. As he states, quote, "This contrast between thought and action, i.e., the coexistence of two conceptions of the world, one affirmed in words and the other displayed in effective actions, is not simply a product of self-deception. Self-deception can be an adequate explanation for a few individuals taken separately, or even for groups of a certain size, but it is not adequate when the contrast occurs in the life of great masses. In these cases, the contrast between thought and action cannot but be the expression of profounder contrasts of a social historical order." End of quote. The subaltern groups often lack organic intellectuals of their own and are thus forced to adopt ideas from the traditional intellectuals who serve the interests of the hegemonic class. This absorption of the ruling class ideas is necessarily passive. The subaltern classes do not actively participate in forming or at least criticizing these ideas that guide their lives. The subaltern groups only passively accept these ideas and are forced to deal with the consequences of the contradictions between their actions and their thoughts. An obvious example of this cognitive dissonance between thought and action might be the defense of property rights by the working class, the class that, by definition, does not own private property and would benefit from its abolishment. Gramsci rejects the notion that the subaltern groups are simply conned by evil geniuses such as Hitler or Mussolini. This explanation both ignores the role of the masses in the power grab of these dictators and portrays them as either powerless, unwilling, or too primitive to enact any change. Gramsci posits that all values and ideas are components of ideologies, which are not just sets of ideas presented by intellectuals, but rather derive from the everyday functions of institutions, organizations, and life activities that support them. The fundamental values accepted by the subaltern groups are often not explicit or conscious. Gramsci rejects the simplistic notion of false consciousness as an explanation of the passivity of the masses. In his writings, Gramsci sought to deepen the Marxist notion of ideology and create a more flexible approach to the relations between base and superstructure. For Gramsci, ideology is not a simple reflection of class interests. The starting point for understanding Gramsci's notion of ideology is the term spontaneous philosophy, a certain way of thinking that everyone has. This spontaneous philosophy has the following elements. First, language itself. Language, in the Gramscian view, is not simply a set of grammatical phenomena devoid of content, but rather an aggregate of determined notions and concepts. The second one is the notion of common sense, something that can be described as a conventional wisdom, and good sense, which incorporates empirical knowledge. And third, popular religion. This notion does not only include religion, but a whole system of beliefs, opinions, ways of understanding things, etc., that are collectively called folklore. According to Lears, one might imagine a spectrum of hegemonic cultures from open to closed. In closed hegemonic cultures, the subaltern groups lack the language of their own to be capable of imagining a political alternative and are thus virtually incapable of creating any counter-hegemony. On the other hand, in open hegemonic cultures, the subaltern groups possess language and thus the options for counter-hegemony flourish. Of course, the placement of hegemonic cultures on this open-closed spectrum depends on specific circumstances and historic moments. It is important to remember that whether the hegemonic culture is open or closed, its main tool of rule is not force, not even manipulation, but legitimization. The ideas, values, and worldview of the hegemonic groups are being validated in public discourse, while those of subaltern groups are not. However, Gramsci admits that ideas of the subaltern groups can flourish outside of the quote-unquote legitimate public discourse. The line between the quote-unquote valid public discourse and its counter-hegemonic counterpart is not an impenetrable barrier, but rather a permeable membrane, which allows for the absorption of the ideas of subaltern groups into the quote-unquote legitimate discourse. Language. In his work, Gramsci was interested in identifying the presence of ideology in the everyday experience of subaltern groups. Gramsci sought to examine the most intimate ways of self-identification of these groups and unearthed what he called common sense. According to Gramsci, all of these cultural forms are creations of individuals and groups at a given moment in history, and they are grounded in the use of language. For Gramsci, language is not a static phenomenon, but rather a still evolving thing in time and space. Language is culture and philosophy. It is a multiplicity of facts that are more or less organically coherent and coordinated. Gramsci not only examines general structures of language, but also focuses on language use that must be contextualized based on its different uses across class lines. For Gramsci, the conception of the world is contained in the language itself. He does not see language in a mere grammatical sense. Instead, it is an overarching phenomenon that encompasses a totality of concepts and meanings, often without the conscious acceptance of the subjects. Gramsci coined the term linguaggio, which encompasses collective representations embedded in language. The Gramscian idea that everyone is a philosopher is reflected here in people's interactions with the social world via language itself. This interaction produces a network of values and attitudes encoded in the language during a given historical period, coupled with personal idiosyncrasies. The use of language creates or stifles the people's ability to change their society. Use of language can be divided into two categories: normative and spontaneous. Normative linguistic practices can be seen as those that uphold pre-existing structures of society, while spontaneous linguistic practices can act as catalysts for change. Both sources of conformity and innovation radiate from things such as schools, churches, writers, the arts, films, etc. Therefore, it is necessary to analyze these aspects of language in order to bring about any form of social change. Thus, language is an important element of hegemony. The distinctive use of language can be seen as a part of Femia's distinction between integral hegemony, in which consent is granted by the majority of the population, and decadent or minimal hegemony, which applies to only certain segments of the population without being imposed on the majority of the population. Gramsci elaborates his notion of language as a phenomenon that embodies a specific conception of the world in the following quote. Quote, "If it is true that every language contains the elements of a conception of the world and of culture, it could also be true that from any one's language one can assess the greater or lesser complexity of his conception of the world. Someone who only speaks a dialect or understands the standard language incompletely necessarily has an intuition of the world which is more or less limited and provincial, which is fossilized and anachronistic in relation to the major currents of the thought which dominate world history." End of quote. Gramsci uses language as an analytical tool used to investigate different conceptions of the world and different ideologies. Just like spontaneous philosophy or common sense, language is neither fully consistent nor arbitrary. Quote, "Language also means culture and philosophy, if only at the level of common sense, and therefore the fact of language is in reality a multiplicity of facts more or less organically coherent and coordinated." End of quote. We can thus say that the Gramscian notion of language represents culture and philosophy, at least on the level of common sense. Language as a metaphor. Ives contends that Gramsci uses language as a sort of metaphor for social and political relations. They put forward the idea that Gramsci uses the structures of language as a metaphor for hegemony. Gramsci, similarly to Saussure or Wittgenstein, rejects the nomenclature model of language. Instead, he sees language as a system or process of meaning production. The meaning is not produced through the relationship between individual words and non-linguistic objects or ideas. Instead, he sees meaning production as a relationship among the elements of language itself. Quote, "The whole of language is a continuous process of metaphor, and the history of semantics is an aspect of the history of culture. Language is at the same time a living thing and a museum of fossils of life and civilizations." End of quote. The idea behind using language as a metaphor for political analysis is the analysis of the representation of ideas and behaviors in the political terrain. Language can be used as a metaphor for political analysis. Gramsci states that, quote, "Present language is metaphorical with respect to the meanings and the ideological content which the words used had in preceding periods of civilization." End of quote. Gramsci argues that the history and historical residue found in the language are fundamental to the operations of power, prestige, and hegemony. Gramsci further elaborates by emphasizing that meaning is created by language in its metaphorical development with respect to previous meanings. New meanings replace the previous one in a continual process of development. Quote, "The new metaphorical meaning spreads with the spread of the new, which furthermore also coins brand new words or absorbs them from other languages as loan words, giving them a precise meaning, and therefore depriving them of the excessive halo they possessed in the original language. Thus, it is probable that for many people the term imminence is known, understood, and used for the first time only in the new metaphorical sense given to it by the philosophy of praxis." End of quote. Quote, "Language is transformed with the transformation of the whole civilization, through the acquisition of culture by new classes, and through the hegemony exercised by one national language over others, etc. And what it does is precisely to absorb in metaphorical form the words of previous civilizations and cultures." End of quote. Language as a model for the national popular collective will. Gramsci's theory of hegemony and language intercept in another way. Language can be seen as a tool for the establishment of national popular will. Gramsci sees the creation of class alliances as a prerequisite for the creation of successful hegemonic structures, and similarly, he sees the necessity for the creation of a common language. This united language, just like a class alliance, allows for the expression of various different opinions, but, in the end, needs to be united enough to serve as a means for the creation of counter-hegemony. From this perspective, the maintenance of hegemony does not necessarily require an active commitment from the subaltern masses for the legitimization of class rule. While people can be dissatisfied with their present condition, they often lack the proper language to articulate their dissatisfaction, leading to the inability to form a proper counter-hegemonic movement. Since the dominant language mainly represents the ideas of the dominant classes, a certain boundary on what is considered to be permissible discourse is established. Gramsci not only ties language to culture, philosophy, and ideology, but also maintains that language cannot be divorced from politics and the operations of power. This leads to disparities between the thoughts and actions of subaltern classes. Subaltern groups tend to accept the hegemonic ideology of the ruling classes, despite their class interests being sharply different from those presented by the ruling classes. While other Marxists saw this phenomenon as a form of false consciousness, Gramsci explains this phenomenon in a different manner. Gramsci identified language as one of the main components of spontaneous philosophy. He relates the study of language as an inseparable part of hegemony and its correlates. The role of intellectuals, culture, and national popular will. He proposes the study of the relationship between intellectuals and the people's nation in terms of language. As he writes, quote, "Every time that the question of language surfaces, in one way or another, it means that a series of other problems are coming to the fore. The formation and enlargement of the governing class, the need to establish more intimate and secure relationship between the governing groups and the national popular mass, in other words, to recognize the cultural hegemony." End of quote. The modern-day examples of linguistic innovations that are inherent to forms of cultural hegemony are, according to Gramsci, new forms of media, such as schools, newsprint writers, theater, cinema, radio, and religious institutions. For Gramsci, the history of language is the history of linguistic innovation, but these innovations are not individual, as it happens in art, but are of an entire social community that has innovated its culture. These innovations in language are connected to folklore and common sense insofar as they are conceptions of the world and of life. Quote, "Linguistic values and meanings are human creations that always exist within history, subject to human collective and individual manipulation within the parameters set by past human actions. Thus, language is not a non-productive realm of communication or merely the transmission of information. Language products, whether Hollywood movies or computer programs, are constituted by language, and this requires that Marxism and all progressive social movements comprehend the importance of language to politics." End of quote. Another facet of language Gramsci explores is professional language. Professional language serves as a gatekeeper, forcing the separation of intellectuals from vulgarization by the subaltern classes, thus cutting them off from practicing in the traditional intellectual circles. Culture and education. In his thesis, Gramsci developed a comprehensive understanding of the role of mass culture in shaping human thought. Gramsci saw mass culture as an important force behind both establishing hegemony and as an useful tool for creation of counter-hegemonic movements. In terms of maintaining hegemonic order, mass media serve the function of maintaining hegemonic order by propagating and reinforcing folkloristic common sense among the masses. This leads to the maintenance of contradictory consciousness among the masses. The active man of the masses, who works practically, lacks a clear theoretical consciousness that can transform the world, resulting in a historical contrast with his work. In Gramsci's works, he saw society as an arena for the political education of the masses. The notion of aligning popular culture with the interests of the state was common during the years when Gramsci was writing, especially in fascist Italy. For example, Mussolini and his son Vittorio, together with certain other members of fascist regime, saw the revolutionary potential of media in their society. Similarly, Gramsci understood the power of literature, newspapers, film, and radio in the creation of consent in the governed populace. Without a doubt, Gramsci was aware of Lenin's work dealing with a similar matter, discussing the revolutionary potential of literature and cinema and acting as a vanguard for revolutionary changes in society. Gramsci sought to explore the relationship between culture and politics and explored aspects of cultural production in an effort to identify obstacles to the creation of a new hegemonic order. His primary objective was to investigate form of cultural production and to situate organic intellectuals in a critical practice for all forms of social activities. To give an example, Gramsci examined the cultural expressions of the fascist society and its effects on the life and politics of the society. Just like Gramsci insisted that intellectuals are not disinterested, even traditional intellectuals who claim to be above society, he saw artists in the similar manner. The position and expressions of artists, just like intellectuals, are deeply rooted in their material conditions. Gramsci saw the position of disinterest as a strategy of intellectuals and artists as a tool for maintaining or resisting the hegemonic order. In other words, Gramsci sought to demystify the notion of artists and intellectuals being some sort of a transcendent bearers of truth and showed their class interests. Gramsci saw the separation between cultural production and culture as a political act serving the class interests of the elite. He also saw this act as elitist in the sense that it enables the producers of culture to appear disjointed from the larger society and enables them to maintain the illusion that they are not a political force. Gramsci maintains that the producers of cultures, whether they are artists or intellectuals, are tied to their historical reality, whether they want to admit it or not. While Gramsci tends to link cultural production with history and philosophy, he does not believe that texts by themselves are direct agents of social change. Rather, he sees them as a part of a larger context of experience and struggle, while not elevating them to the position of the main actors in the reinforcement of hegemony or the creation of counter-hegemony. Another facet of the creation of hegemony or counter-hegemony in Gramsci's work can be, for example, the school system. Quote, "The idea and effect of work, of theoretical and practical activity, was the educational principle latent in the primary school, since it is by means of work that the social and state order, rights and duties is introduced and identified within the natural order." End of quote. And again, applying his thesis of everyone being an intellectual, he says, quote, there is no human activity from which every form of intellectual participation can be excluded. Homo faber cannot be separated from Homo sapiens. End of quote. Quote, studying, too, is a job and a very tiring one, with its own particular apprenticeship, involving muscles and nerves as well as intellect. It is a process of adaptation, a habit acquired with effort, tedium, and even suffering. End of quote. Conclusion. The perspective of Gramsci is more intricate than many detractors who oppose Marxism have acknowledged. It challenges the belief in economic determinism upheld by the Second International, expands the concept of ideology, and shifts the focus away from the excessive preoccupation with economic factors that determine social class. This assertion recognizes the state as a multifaceted political institution and highlights the significance of cultural interpretations of the human condition. The notion of cultural hegemony is used to delve into the issue of power dynamics, including many different people, such as parents, preachers, teachers, journalists, intellectuals, experts, entertainment promoters, popular performers, sport figures, and celebrities. Gramsci's notion of hegemonic consent recognizes disparities in wealth and power, even within democratic systems, and aims to demonstrate how these inequalities have been upheld or contested in the realm of culture. It offers a vocabulary for recognizing components within the prevailing culture that reinforce established power dynamics and those that undermine them. In contrast to liberal ideas of consent, Gramsci's perspective recognizes the social and economic limitations faced by marginalized groups and seeks to understand how culture interacts with these constraints. Gramsci highlights the significance of human individuals in shaping culture, taking into account their specific desires and interests that are influenced by society. This perspective avoids seeing society as an entity with distinct needs and goals that are separate from human actions. Gramsci's analysis of language and culture provides a deep insight into the systematic marginalization of subaltern groups, which occurs not just via economic and political methods, but also through cultural and intellectual dominance. The position of subaltern groups, as conceptualized by him, sheds light on the intricate nature of social groupings that do not possess an unified, internally developed perspective. Instead, they depend on fragmented and forced ideas that often contradict their actual life experiences. Gramsci's study highlights the significance of language as a means of exerting control and dominance. Language influences our understanding of the world, both as a means to promote prevailing beliefs and also as a possible trigger for opposition to the prevalent views. Gramsci's analysis of language use across various social strata exposes the complex mechanisms through which cultural dominance is maintained and contested. The concept that every person is a philosopher emphasizes the widespread influence of ideology and the possibility for intellectual and cultural opposition. Gramsci highlights the need for organic intellectuals among subaltern groups, emphasizing the need to cultivate a critical and cohesive worldview that aligns with the experiences and ambitions of these people. This would empower people to express their own perspectives and successfully question the prevailing narrative. In essence, Gramsci's work prompts us to contemplate the significance of culture and language in the wider endeavor for social justice. Through the identification and examination of cultural systems that sustain inequality, we may get a deeper understanding of the barriers to and potential for transformational social change. Having this comprehension is essential for constructing a more equal community in which the viewpoints and opinions of marginalized groups are not only acknowledged but also appreciated and included in the shared consciousness. For Antonio Gramsci, culture wasn't a background detail, it was the very terrain where hegemony is built. A subtle, persistent force that teaches us what to value, what to ignore, and who gets to speak. Hegemony, he said, is never total. It must be constantly renewed, reinforced, and defended. And that means there is always room for resistance. Always space for the subaltern classes to push back, to speak, to be heard. Gramsci gave voice to those kept at the margins, not by accident, but by design. The subaltern classes denied power not only by politics, but by culture, by language, by silence. The challenge is not only to win political power, but to transform the consciousness shaped by centuries of domination. This is the legacy of Gramsci's thought, a call to uncover the hidden mechanics of consent, to confront the cultural foundations of inequality, and to imagine new forms of solidarity from below. Thanks for watching episode 5. In our next chapter, we will explore Gramsci's vision of political strategy through his concepts of the modern prince, war of position, and war of maneuver, and what they mean for the movements today.